Well, I'm joined now by our panel of political commentators. Susan Smith is a Liberal commentator, Tim Powers is a Conservative commentator, and Kim Wright is an NDP commentator. Good to see you all. Thanks for being here. Susan, look, the government's facing this firestorm over the allegations of political interference in the RCMP investigation into the mass shootings in Halifax. Are there questions that need to be answered here, and what's the best way to get at them?
Well, I think your main word is allegations, Peter, and I think you have to look at where the questions are coming from, and they're coming from the opposition, who are trying to make any hay they can in the final days before things rise for the summer. There is an ongoing investigation about what happened in that tragic window of time with Portapique, where 22 people were shot. I think it's fair to say that people have many questions for how that entire incident unfolded, and that's where the questions should be. What happened? Why were people delayed in notifications? How did this man accumulate what he accumulated? Right. And those are the questions that are being asked by the inquiry, and those are the questions. Right, but opposition
MPs are asking questions based on the notes provided by a senior superintendent of the RCMP suggesting that there was political interference. So isn't there a basis for these questions?
I haven't seen the superintendent's notes. I think it's legitimate to ask. There are questions that can be asked in the wake of such a terrible, tragic incident. Whether someone's notes or someone's interpretation of some freelancing that's written on the side, I don't know. I wasn't there. I wasn't in the room. But I think the main issue is getting to the bottom of what happened in Portapique and making sure it doesn't happen ever again.
All right. Tim, the Public Safety Committee will hold at least one hearing at the end of July with the RCMP Commissioner, Bill Blair, and the Nova Scotia RCMP Superintendent at the center of this story. How big of a problem do you think this is for the government?
It's a big problem for the government because it isn't the opposition that brought this forward. It was the Halifax Examiner, and in examining the mass casualty report, who found Superintendent Campbell's notes. There's no equivocation in those notes. And you've since had former Commissioner Paulson, former Deputy Commissioner, Assistant Commissioner Boudreau, and others come out and say, Superintendent Campbell, he's a credible person. One, I think, described him as the most effective major crimes investigator in Canada. So you can't just dismiss that. That's serious. And whether Commissioner Lucki stepped forward and said things she shouldn't have had. There were other people in that room, apparently. This needs to have more than the Public Safety Committee look at it, because what Superintendent Campbell wrote about what he believed happened in that meeting is pretty concerning, right, if he is accurate.
Well, there's all kinds of course, the story has all kinds of sort of legs to it and layers to it. And we did get a statement from the RCMP commissioner, but it's worth, I think, Kim pointing out that in her statement, Brenda Lucki never takes issue with what Darren Campbell, the superintendent, says she said at the meeting. She talks about a different approach and some of the concerns that's been raised, but she never says what he said isn't true. So what's your view on what's happening here?
Yeah, and that's a very big distinction, Peter, that she's not suggesting it isn't accurate. This isn't a situation, as the Prime Minister likes to say, where somebody experienced something differently. We are talking about a major mass shooting. But then subsequently, the government decided to once again bring out the specter of potentially doing something about guns in this country, handgun bans and assault rifle bans, and none of it actually gets done. And what we see time after time will be that, here, let's be distracted over here. We'll talk about regulations and gun crimes and not get to actually the problem, which is some serious questionable judgment that had led up to that mass shooting and subsequent to it. So there's a lot of things that we need to look at within the RCMP. A couple of summers ago, Bill Blair was supposed to go back and do some homework about an overhaul of the RCMP and how they deal with Indigenous communities, what's happening with missing and murdered Indigenous women. We've had, a few more come up since then, and none of this gets done. So that's where people people get really frustrated and really angry.
Okay.
But the fact that there's nothing changing is still very questionable to me.
So we'll have some form of hearings. Not sure exactly how long they'll be, but that'll happen later in July. But Susan, let me switch here to talk about, there's lots of things we could talk about the spring sitting, but I think the sort of reigning feature of the spring sitting was the Liberal-NDP supply and confidence deal. It was clearly a key feature of the last number of months, given that it took the threat of a snap election off the table. How do you believe it's delivered better governance for Canadians?
I do believe it's delivered better governance for Canadians. I think one of the key features of the spring sitting were the horns honking and the bouncy castles and hay bales on fire in front of Parliament Hill on Wellington Street. As a result of that, or one of the outcomes of that, were increased conversations between the Prime Minister and Jagmeet Singh, and they did this agreement. And I think what it's done is create some stability, some ability for runway for good public policy decisions to be made, not with one eye on election footing, but an eye on all eyes on best public policy. I think it's going to allow the temperature in the country to come down, given the heated rhetoric around the conservative leadership that isn't dialing down. That temperature continues to be turned up, especially by the front runner. So I think it's a good deal. I think it's a good idea it's provided good opportunity for Canadians. And when you see things like dental care, and when that comes to fruition, that will be a concrete result of the agreement. Okay.
Tim, what do you see as the key impact of the Liberal-NDP deal during this sitting, and how has it affected the role of the official opposition?
I think I will agree there's predictability. I don't necessarily think that predictability will be of 3 years duration, because I think different sorts of politics will take over. So that's an immediate impact. I do wonder, Peter, if it's created complacency in the Liberals, because the Liberals in the last number of weeks have had all manner of mistake made, usually by themselves, and seem not to be too flustered about that. Maybe it's because they feel they have the security of the NDP and they don't have to be as determined as they once were. But we've had, ministers like Mendocino, Minister Joly, Minister Alghabra, who've all struggled at different times and have not created their behavior among them, a great sense of competency in the Canadian public. For the Conservatives, I think it's a bit frustrating, but there also may be some benefit they're not realizing yet, that it keeps them from ridiculous overstating and posturing on elections right now, because I do agree with Susan. I don't think people want that right now, but I think they feel it's a bit limiting in any threat they utter, because they know where the NDP are currently aligned.
Okay, Kim Wright, some might argue that giving the minority government a guarantee of up to 3 years might actually slow down action on key issues. Tim sort of alluded to that. How much more action on NDP priorities might we be seeing if the NDP had not abandoned the threat of bringing down the government?
Yeah, look, I will absolutely unreservedly do not believe we would have seen a substantial movement on dental care. I think we would have seen press releases, but I don't think we would have seen it in the budget or substantial. And why do I say that? Because the Liberals took it out of their platform last election, even though they had it in before. So here's what I know, that's in there. This is an ongoing conversation. And if the government thinks that they get to completely ignore the New Democrats and those conversations they should be having in a minority government on the priorities of Canadians, they do so at their peril. Look, this is an ongoing discussion. And like any relationship, when you stop wooing your partners, it's going to get ugly.
All right. A lot to ask here, but just 20 seconds or so each. Just what are you watching for in the next couple of months here while Parliament's not here? What's the big story to keep an eye on? Susan?
I think it's the Conservative leadership Leslyn Lewis was meeting with convoy people inside Parliament Hill yesterday, and 9 other Conservative MPs, keeping an eye on the front-runner, Pierre Poilievre. And for me, it's how big a hole can he dig himself in terms of outrageous and outlandish statements that he makes, that we then get to hold him to account for if he's the guy that's crossed first over the finish line.
Tim, big story you're watching.
Yeah, I think it's leadership. And the second one, Peter, is the Liberal government reboot. Is there a big cabinet shuffle coming? Because as I said a moment ago, they have some performance challenges they need to address.
Okay. Kim, what about you?
Couple of things. Mostly, that poll that we saw floating around out of Main Street around Pierre Poilievre not being able to win his own seat. Is Pierre Poilievre the Stephen Del Duca of federal politics? Who knows? But we're going to see this play out over the barbecue circuit, first and foremost at Stampede, when you've got UCP candidates and Conservative leadership. Lots of barbecues.
Okay, who doesn't like a barbecue? Thank you all for your time tonight. Really appreciate it, and we'll talk again. Have a great summer.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.